1584. A notary in Toledo writes something in a leather-bound ledger that shouldn't exist. Subject's pupils, 4 mm at rest, 6 mm when presented with host, insufficient dilation, flag for secondary observation. He's measuring a woman's eyes during communion, recording the diameter of her pupils when she looks at the cross, not for medicine, for evidence. Her name was Isabel de Córdoba. She was 33, and in 18 months, men would cite the size of her pupils as proof she should burn. But here's what doesn't make sense. By 1584, this wasn't new. The Inquisition had been measuring women's bodies for over a century. Pulse rates, tear production, how many times they blinked during prayer. They had entire manuals dedicated to what a woman's flesh would reveal when her words wouldn't. What were they actually looking for? And why did they need 300 pages of instructions to find it? If you've ever wondered what institutions do, when they stop looking for truth and start manufacturing it, you're in the right place. This is Crimson Historians. We find the documents they buried. Hit subscribe, because what happened to Isabel? It happened to 60,000 other women, and the method they used didn't die in Spain. Spain, 1478. The Inquisition begins. Most people think they know this story. Religious extremists hunting heretics, Jews forced to convert, the accused tortured until they confess, flames, screaming, the rack. That's not wrong, but it's not complete. Because here's what the numbers show. Between 1480 and 1530, the Inquisition executed about 2,000 people. Terrible. Documented, but in the same period, they interrogated over 40,000. And of those 40,000, roughly 23,000 were released without execution. So what were they doing with the other 21,000 hours? The answer is in the archives, in Valladolid, in Seville, in repositories across Spain, where researchers are still finding ledgers that most people will never see. These aren't confession transcripts. They're observation logs. Subject perspired when asked about Sabbath. Subject's hands remained dry when touching crucifix. Subject failed to produce tears during passion recitation. Observed 3 consecutive times. Page after page. Woman after woman. Pulse. Pupils. Perspiration. Tears. Trembling. The Inquisition wasn't just prosecuting heresy. They were building a catalogue of how the body betrays what the mind conceals. And they had one population. They practiced this on more than any other. By 1540, nearly 58% of those brought before tribunals were women. Not because women were committing more heresy, because the Inquisition believed women's bodies would reveal it more clearly. Why women? What did they think the female body would show that men's wouldn't? Isabel's door opens on a Tuesday, September 1589. 2 men, familiaris, Inquisition officers. They don't shout, don't break anything. One of them shows her a rolled parchment with a wax seal. She's not told what she's accused of. That comes later. First, she's taken to what they call the audience chamber. Not a dungeon, not a torture room. A chamber that looks almost bureaucratic. Table, 3 chairs, crucifix on the wall. Window with iron bars, but the sunlight still comes through. The ordinariness is deliberate. Because here's what's in the Inquisition training manuals. Yes, they had training manuals, written by Tomás de Torquemada himself in 1484 and revised 6 times by 1570. Here's what they say about the first 72 hours. The accused who enters in terror will confess to anything. The accused who enters in composure will reveal everything. They didn't want panic. They wanted observation, because terrified people are useless for what they're actually trying to do. Isabel sits in that room for 6 hours before anyone speaks to her. Just sits, with 2 notaries watching from behind a wooden screen. They're not writing her confession. She hasn't said anything. They're writing descriptions. Subject shifts position every 11 minutes. Subject touches face 4 times in first hour. Subject's breathing rate increases when footsteps approach door. They're not interrogating her. They're cataloguing her. And here's the detail that reframes everything. Isabel doesn't know it yet, but she's already failed 3 tests. Not tests of faith, tests of biology. Let's pause Isabel's story for a moment, because to understand what happens to her, you need to understand what the Inquisition actually believed about the human body. In 1487, 9 years after the Inquisition's founding, 2 inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published a book, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. Most people know it as a witch-hunting manual. It is. But buried in Part 2, Question 1, Article 6, there's a section called Whether Witches Can Habitate the Power of Generation and Obstruct the Venereal Act. Translation. Whether a person's body, when touched by evil, would physically respond differently than a pure body. The Inquisitors took this idea and ran with it. They theorized, wrongly but consistently, that conversion to Christianity wasn't just spiritual, it was physiological. That when someone genuinely accepted Christ, their nervous system would change. Their tears would come easier during Mass. Their pulse would quicken before the Eucharist. Their pupils would dilate at the sight of the Virgin. And if those responses didn't happen, the body was remembering something else. By 1520, there were Inquisition physicians, not to heal, to measure. They had instruments, calipers for measuring pupil dilation, water clocks for timing pulse rates, graduated vials for collecting and measuring tears. In Seville, in 1537, a tribunal spent 4 months testing this theory. They brought in 50 confirmed conversos, Jews who'd converted to Christianity, and 50 old Christians, people whose families had been Catholic for generations. Then they ran both groups through identical religious exercises while measuring physical responses. The results, still in the archive, showed no consistent difference. None. The conversos cried, didn't cry, trembled, stayed calm, dilated, constricted, in the exact same random patterns as the old Christians. One of the inquisitors, Francisco Peña, wrote in the margin, "The flesh does not differentiate what the soul contains. Our instruments detect nothing." And then he wrote one more sentence, "Continue observations, expand sample size." They knew their method didn't work by 1537, and they used it for another 150 years. That's not ignorance, that's something else. Back to that room in Toledo. It's now been 18 hours since Isabel's arrest. She hasn't slept, hasn't eaten anything but bread and water. The window behind her shows it's night now. Finally, an inquisitor enters. His name is in the records. Alonso de Mendoza. He's 58. He's been doing this for 22 years. He carries a wooden case about the size of a prayer book. He doesn't sit across from Isabel. He sits beside her, close enough that she can smell the ink on his clothes. The questions start, but they're not about Judaism. Not at first. Describe your wedding night. Isabel blinks, hesitates. She's been married 14 years. She has a daughter. What does this have to do with heresy? Mendoza opens the wooden case. Inside, a glass vial, a thin brass rod with millimeter markings, a small mirror. "I asked you to describe your wedding night. Did you feel joy?" She answers. "Yes, of course." "Did you weep?" "No." "Should she have?" Mendoza makes a note. Then he asks her about her daughter's birth, whether she prayed during labor, which saint she invoked, whether she felt ecstasy, his word, ecstasy, when the child first breathed. Isabel is trying to figure out the right answer, but there isn't one, because he's not listening to her words. He's watching her carotid artery. The notary behind the screen is timing her pulse with a water clock, counting how many beats pass in the time it takes for water to drip from one chamber to another. Then Mendoza does something that appears in dozens of Inquisition transcripts, but is almost never discussed in history books. He takes out the mirror, holds it 6 inches from Isabel's face, and asks her to look at the crucifix on the wall while he watches her reflection. What is he looking at? Her pupils. In the records there's a notation, subjects, pupils constricted when viewing crucifix. Expected dilation absent. inconsistent with documented response of genuine converts. Expected by whom? Based on what? There's no citation, no reference, just an assertion that Isabel's eyes should have responded differently. But here's the detail that makes this worse. Isabel knows what he's doing. Because by 1589, everyone knows. Converso families have been teaching their daughters for 2 generations how to perform the right physical responses. Cry when you take communion. Let your hands shake when you kiss the cross. Practice dilating your pupils by looking at candlelight before bed. Isabel has practiced. She's 43 years old, and she's spent 20 of those years making her body lie. And it's still not enough. After 22 hours of interrogation, Isabel is taken to a cell. Not a dungeon, not yet. A room, 10 feet by 12 feet, 1 candle, a straw mattress, a bucket, and a cellmate. Her name, according to the records, is Maria Enriquez. She's 51. She tells Isabel she's been here for 3 weeks, accused of reading prohibited books. She seems kind, exhausted, sympathetic. She's lying. This is in the Inquisition manuals too. Section titled